13th, 2006, the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society is pleased to present Peter Mirsky, who will speak about the Mirsky family at the Agudath Israel Synagogue in Ottawa.
Ladies and gentlemen, can I have your attention, please? Before we start the formal part of this evening's program, I'd like everybody to rise and pay a minute's respect to the late Lawrence Friedman. Thank you. For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm John Holzman, and I've been the Vice President of the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society, and because of the untimely passing of Lawrence, I've kind of become the new president. So I'm going to be carrying on as an interim president till we have our annual general meeting, which will be later in the fall. I do want to say that we are continuing to run the organization the way it was run with Lawrence. We are carrying on all the projects and all the initiatives that Lawrence had started. We're continuing to do things the way he wanted them to be done, so there basically will not be a major change in the organization, so that it will just carry on. We, such things as our taping of the eulogies at funerals is still going on, and this is something that Lawrence was very much in favor of and was the one that helped getting it started. Second of all, I think most of you realize we are in the process of publishing a book on the history of the Jews in the city of Ottawa, and we're continuing to do that. We have 3 authors who are writing the book, and we hope to have the book published by the end of 2007. And Lawrence, I'm sure a lot of you knew that Lawrence went around and collected a large sum of money that's being held for the publishing of the book. And any money that is left over will be turned into an endowment for the Historical Society. So this is, and again, we are going to dedicate the book. The original idea of the book came from the late Albert Rivers, but because of Lawrence's passing, the committee, there is an editorial committee of which Anna Bilski is the chairperson. We've decided also to dedicate the book to Lawrence, because Lawrence was really the one that got the book going. And the last thing, as I mentioned a bit earlier, we hope to have our annual meeting in sometime in the late fall. So this is my first meeting as chairperson, and so now we'll get to mainly the reason why we are here, and I'm going to ask Millie Mirsky to introduce our guest speaker for the evening.
It's an honor for me to introduce Peter. After all, it was my great-grandfather, Moses Bilski, who brought... Can't hear me. It is an honor for me to introduce... Can you hear me now? It is an honor for me to introduce Peter. After all, it was my great-grandfather, Moses Bilski, who brought Peter's great-grandfather, Jacob Mirsky, to be Ottawa's first spiritual leader, Shochet, Moel, and Cantor. Reverend Mirsky served the community for 50 years. Now this makes Peter a fourth-generation Ottawan, not a third, that was printed in the Bulletin and in the Historical Society's newsletter. Peter is a lawyer and an associate of Lawrence Pascoe and Howard Lithwick in the law firm Mirsky Pascoe. He is the oldest of 5, and he is married, and he has 3 children. Peter will talk about the history of the Mirsky family, and including Pure Spring, which was founded by his grandfather, David Mirsky. I had the pleasure of attending the wedding of Peter's daughter, Jenny, several years ago. Peter's toast to the bride was memorable, touching, very moving, and funny. We are in for a treat. Please join me in welcoming Peter Mirsky.
Thank you, Millie, very, very much. I don't disagree with anything you've said so far. Someone suggested that I give this talk, and I think they did so because they learnt that I was engaged in some research of the Mirsky family. In actual fact, what I was researching was the Pure Spring Company, as much as the Mirsky family, and perhaps more so. But the fact is, for the Mirsky family, that the family, our branch of the family, was Pure Spring, and Pure Spring was our family. That's how interconnected I feel our family has been. I have not researched, and I certainly wouldn't have the time here tonight before you all fall asleep to get into every branch of the Mirsky family or a complete history. For example, I'm not going to deal with the dark side of the family. That's the one with all the hair. My side of the family doesn't have hair, and I'm going to stick with that side of the family. I'm also very interested in Old Ottawa. I wanted to trace my family, and I wanted to find along the way some evidence of my family, of their roots, of the stones, of the building materials of Pure Spring. And I've often always spent a lot of time walking the streets of downtown Ottawa, and that set me off in my search. Certainly for an immigrant family such as the Mirskys, a family from Russia, somewhere between Russia and Poland, a family that inevitably or eventually owned their own business. It was a dream come true. Our business, the Pure Spring Company, was started by my grandfather, David, and the business was everything to our family and to many more people in Ottawa, perhaps some of you indeed. There are many in Ottawa who can remember summer jobs and opportunities they had working on the Pure Spring delivery trucks. There are many who can remember the soft drinks and the products that Pure Spring sold. At Pure Spring's height, it outsold Coca-Cola in Ottawa on a volume basis. It was a very, very successful enterprise. Can any of you remember some of the flavors of those drinks, such as honey orange, ginger ale, grapefruit and lime, minted grape, Swiss cream soda, Uptown, ginny, spruce beer, root beer? Pure Spring and soft drinks were in vogue. We weren't all as concerned with our health perhaps then as we are today. The whole business, quite frankly, was fun. Now I'm a bit ahead of myself. I want to explain to you, as a lawyer would, first of all, I'm not a historian. Don't write anything down. I'm not giving you any warranty on anything I have to say. I've researched some of my facts at the Ottawa Public Library. I've looked through corporate records. For the most part as well, I've listened to our family at family gatherings. I've heard some of the anecdotes repeated by members of our family. And as I say, I've walked central Ottawa. I've looked at some old maps of old Ottawa. And it's led me to try and find the history of our family in Pierce Spring on the ground. I do say, and I suppose it's the right place to say it, that I've loved history. I love history, but I have limited historical interests or interest in history. Now, I guess we'll start at the beginning, as much of the beginning as we could. And that start is with my great-grandfather, Jacob. So much as I know of Jacob is that he was born in Russia, in Minsk, in 1859. He died in 1942, so he was 83 years of age. My understanding is that he'd retired about 10 or 15 years before he died. He had 4 children by his first wife. David was his eldest child, and David was my grandfather. And David was born in 1890. There followed Abe, Rose, Reeve, and Sam. And Sam was the last child born in 1899. Many of you would remember Dr. Sam. He was chief of internal medicine at the Ottawa Civic Hospital. Very, very fine man. 2 months after Sam was born, and Sam was born in Ottawa, the only child to be born in Ottawa, Jacob's wife died. Jacob married twice after that. The first marriage ended in divorce. I don't know anything about that particular wife. The second wife was Dora, and that marriage, so far as I know, endured. The son, Abe, unfortunately was killed in a motor vehicle accident. He was driving one of our trucks, one of the company's trucks, something in and around 1919, as I understand it. While he was up the Gatineau on a hill, the truck stalled and rolled back, and that must have been very difficult, I'm sure, for our family. Now, Jacob brought his family, except for Sam, to New York about 1894. It was said that in order to get out of Russia, he changed his name from Isakovich to Mirsky, and it was always said that he hid under a load of hay. I don't know. It may be that he had watched Fiddler on the Roof, and that he figured enough of these pogroms, and with Fiddler on the Roof in his mind, he figured it was time to move out, and he did. But I think we all understand that in the 1890s there was quite an exodus out of Russia, and my grandfather was just one of them. I can well imagine that he lived something like on a shtetl, but it is also somewhat interesting to me that he didn't have a child until he was in his 30s. And maybe that speaks of what he did when he was in Russia. So I can't verify anything except from little bits I've heard from our family. That is anything that went on in Russia. I do know that he went to New York, and I do know that he studied in a yeshiva in New York. Other than that, the name Mirsky that was taken up, all one can say is that Mir is named in the river, a very well-known river in Russia. And Mir in Russian means peace, and ski is simply from. And so there's nothing uncommon about Mirsky. It's just from the river Mir. Now, what training Jacob had is also a mystery. Did he study rabbinically in New York, or had he some rabbinical training before that? I'm not sure. The legend and the verbal or oral history was that they wanted to draft him into the military, and he thought the best thing was to hide under the hay. So I've seen a picture of him at Britannia, a family picture, and he was a very slight gentleman in his youth, and he would have been perfect for cannon fodder in the Russian army. So I'll have to give him credit for getting out as fast as he did. He did apparently go and study in the yeshiva. He had, at that time, 1897, the time that Moses Bilski went down and collected him and brought him back to Ottawa, he would have had all of his children except for about Sam. Now, it was said that he was the cantor and communal shohet of the first Jewish synagogue in Ottawa, the Adith Jeshurun, and I apologize, I'm not stating that pronouncing it correctly, and that was on King Edward Avenue. Now, here my research says otherwise. The building is there, but that is the synagogue on King Edward, and I remember going as a child. But my records indicate he probably arrived in Ottawa in 1897, and through the city directory at the Ottawa Public Library, I found him first recorded as living on St. Patrick Street in 1898 at number 413 and being described as a reverend and pastor of the Jewish synagogue. So we are now at a point in time, historically, of the commencement of organized Jewish worship in Ottawa. The synagogue was said to be at 421 Sussex Drive, and that obviously does not exist, but it's in the vicinity of the bay. At the same time, at the very same time, is recorded a Jewish synagogue at number 264 Murray Street, and another Reverend, Jacob Kamen, C-A-M-E-N, as rabbi, and a caretaker called by the name of Samuel Sulensky. The next entry is 1906, and by this time my great-grandfather Jacob had moved to 214 Clarence Street and was then the rabbi or reverend of the synagogue, which was at 275 King Edward Street, built in 1900. By 1906 as well, there was a synagogue on Murray Street. The synagogue on Murray Street had moved up to Rideau Street and was occupying number 417. So the synagogue from Murray Street was no longer. The rabbi on Rideau Street in 1906 was Joseph Berger. I remember my grandfather. I guess he couldn't get the Jewish pronunciation out of his mind, because that restaurant in Hull called Madame Berger, he used to always refer to it as Madame Berger's. By 1921, Jacob lived at 359 Cumberland Street, where he stayed until his death in 1942, or so I thought, but I'm corrected. Probably several years before that, and after his retirement, he lived on Chapel Street. But with respect to Cumberland, he was there a very long time while he ministered to the congregation. And my father can well remember going to visit, understanding, of course, that there was a new wife and a new family. But nonetheless, they went often enough to visit Jacob. And on a cold evening in late fall, when it was dark and early, my father can remember going out the back into the outbuildings and watching Jacob by a lantern kill chickens. And I guess he was the shochet. My grandfather, David, was only 7 or 8 when he came to Ottawa. He apparently left school at the age of 14, so he didn't have much of an education, and that was in 1914. He always had some difficulty throughout his life reading, writing, and he was somewhat uncomfortable with that and self-conscious. He understood the importance of education, and he just regretted the fact that he didn't have more. But my grandfather David was an industrious man. At the age of 14, he started selling confections, candy, newspapers on the train. I think it was the CPR up to Maniwaki. And I've seen a picture of him, a slight, shortish fellow, 5'6" perhaps, with a uniform, a conductor, or sort of a train uniform, and a little peaked cap, standing beside the drive wheel of the locomotive. And I tell you, he wasn't much more than a cap's height above the drive wheel, but he looked extremely proud. On the train, my grandfather noticed that bottles were scarce, bottles to sell drinks, and that they were often cast aside. So he thought that was an opportunity, and he started to collect them. So by 1914, at the age of 24, he's noted as living on Murray Street at number 298. And he is operating a bottle business. He collected bottles. And at 292 Murray Street, he did that with a man named Brabinski, and it was a partnership called Mirsky and Brabinski. We have no idea who Mr. Brabinski was. At this time, he that is, my grandfather was not described as a bottler. Bottlers were listed. Coke was listed as a bottler. My grandfather was simply shown as being in the bottle business. Then about 1921, my grandfather David moved up to Albert Street, number 740 Albert Street. And he did that to be close to his new business, which was on Wellington Street. They rented at 740 Albert Street, and my father can remember taking the rent to the landlord. This was just near Booth Street on Albert Street, in a brick tenement, now torn down, but similar to others that are still standing. They had a porch, and my father remembers watching the drunks stagger over the Chaudière Bridge from Hull and up Booth Street to Albert Street. It was a rough neighborhood. There were fights, and there were religious taunts, and my father learned to box, and he boxed successfully even in university. He stood up for himself, and he stood up for his brothers. And they were a tight-knit family. David married Sadie Weinberg, and they had the three boys, Norman, Jack, and my father, Mervyn. Mervyn and Jack were identical twins. Norman was born in 1912, Mervyn and Jack in 1914. You may remember, I think, that the Parliament buildings burnt down in 1916, and my father hadn't yet mastered or couldn't be convicted of playing with matches, but just to get the timing. 1916, 2 years later, Parliament buildings burnt. Why and how did my grandfather move? Well, my grandfather was selling bottles, and then he started putting water in the bottles. And because he was selling bottles and collecting bottles, he was introduced to a market for bottles. There were a lot of breweries in Ottawa, and one of those breweries was operated by E.P. Taylor, the very famous magnate E.P. Taylor, the E.P. Taylor of Northern Dancer fame, Winfield Farms fame, and this was repeated at our dining table over the years, and I couldn't quite understand just how my grandfather would be befriended by someone of the magnitude of E.P. Taylor. Well, again, my grandfather collected bottles. Harry Brading of Brading's Brewery had a brewery on Wellington Street near the Archives, and Harry Brading had a grandson. Harry Brading's grandson was E.P. Taylor, and E.P. Taylor and Harry Brading were Ottawa boys. They rose, E.P. Taylor rose to considerable height and prominence and moved to Toronto, but he was an Ottawa boy. And because my grandfather approached him with bottles, he was befriended by E.P. Taylor. The Brading's Brewery was close to the foot of Bronson Avenue and the cliff, and it is said that a fresh spring of water came from that cliff, and the brewery was using it. My grandfather tapped in and started selling bottled water. In 1914, I believe, there was a very serious, and I think the last major outbreak of typhoid in Ottawa. People needed good water, and so my grandfather started selling that water, and he got it from E.P. Taylor and the Bradings family, and he started renting premises from Bradings on Wellington Street, just beyond the present Archives building. So, I really wanted to find this site. I'm still looking for photographs. There's nothing there now but grass, and you know that part of the Wellington Street still curves around underneath Bronson Avenue. I have the number, 477 Wellington Street, but unfortunately there's not much left. Pure Spring in 1918, 1919, in the 20s, was a store on Wellington Street and a factory at the back leading down to Baldwin Street, which ran perpendicular or along from the pump house parallel to Wellington Street. That formula was fairly common. Bradings had a shop, a retail shop in the front, and they manufactured the beer behind. And then the land sloped down to the river and to the outlet of the water stream that came from the pump house. What was the area like? Well, the Breton Flats was extremely busy. It had been devastated in 1900 by a major fire, but it was industrious and bustling with commerce, nothing like it is today. So, of course, the city wasn't very large as well. They were on the outskirts of central Ottawa. And so it made some sense to have the factory there. What was it like at the factory? I have little glimpses of what went on at the factory, what went on in those days, and through them, it's the only look, the only vision I can get of what it was like to work at that factory. A couple of incidents. My grandfather employed what we always heard was an old Russian. In fact, he was Meyer Balin, one of the progenitors or family of the present Balin family. And Meyer was quite part of the Mirskys at Pure Spring, and he, in fact, did the deliveries. He drove the sleigh in the winter and the wagon in the summer. He probably did work in the factory. He was very instrumental. In order to exit the loading dock at the rear of the factory, the land sloped down, and I can see that now from Wellington Street downwards, and you needed to build steam going out of the loading dock. You needed to turn sharp left and head up to Wellington Street. And my Uncle Norman used to tell me, used to brag, that on one occasion, when Meyer was going to make, and I hope you're not going to prosecute, it's a little late for that, when Meyer was going to make a delivery, Meyer jumped on the wagon, smacked the reins, cracked the whip, and yelled at the horses to move, and off they went. But unbeknownst to Meyer, Norman, always the practical joker, had switched the reins from left to right. So he pulled the left rein, and the horses went right down into the hill and the river. And Meyer forgave him for a while, until Norman crept up and lit the newspaper he was reading on fire in the front office. My grandfather could never get away with this, but he used to keep a bottle of whiskey in his office on Wellington Street. Now, it could be said, and I think no one could argue, Jacob was reverend. Jacob was the reverend. My grandfather was a little irreverent, and there were similarities, there were common traits and qualities, but my grandfather certainly led a somewhat different lifestyle than Jacob. So when he kept his bottle of whiskey in his side table, he noticed after a while in his Wellington Street office that the bottle seemed to be going down somewhat faster than the pleasure he could recall. He suspected a thief, and he also suspected some of his staff. This was a time, again, on Wellington Street where they had horses. My version is that he got what's known as horse emetic. It was the kind of tonic that one gave a horse if the horse wasn't digesting his food properly. And he put a little bit of it in the whiskey. The result exposed 3 people. One didn't make it home. One did make it home, but came to grief at about 1 o'clock in the morning. Today he'd be charged, but it was a different world. In fact, my grandfather, David, he quite enjoyed a bottle of whiskey or his whiskey every day, smoked cigars every day. And his his nutritional secret was ice cream and cream soda. And unfortunately, he was hard on himself. But those were hard times, very, very hard times. My grandfather worked very hard. In 1925, he incorporated the Pure Spring. And I got the incorporation documents out of the public records, and I was surprised to find that Meyer Balin, the very same, the gentleman that took the bath in the Ottawa River, Meyer Balin was an initial subscriber to the corporation, and he was an interim director of the corporation. And although you wouldn't say that he signed his name with precision, he signed his name. And he was obviously literate. I understand that he was extremely close to the family and spent a lot of time at my grandfather's home. And it may be, I think the best spin you can put on it is that he was well loved in our family, Otherwise, my uncle never would have switched the reins. Now, interesting, in the objects of the corporation, I find that the corporation was organized or incorporated for the purpose of manufacturing and selling bottles, soft drinks, and alcohol. There has been some talk over the years, and a lot of winks and smiles, about my grandfather David being a bootlegger. At first blush, I would deny it because I didn't think it was very complimentary. The older I get, I'm starting to think it is complimentary. And what I do know, and what I've heard, is that indeed, when it was unlawful in the United States during Prohibition, it was lawful in Canada, and my grandfather either manufactured or did indeed sell liquor. But the closest he got to breaking the law, in my view, was the middle of the river at Prescott. And I wouldn't call that bootlegging. That's just delivery. I think one has to have a feeling for the time. 1925 he incorporates. 1927 he moves his family up to Powell Avenue in the Glebe. What a nice place that was. They owned the place. My father often speaks of the luxury of it and the comfort. Then in 1931, the Depression, my grandfather almost lost everything, but he survived. And my grandmother served food, as many people did, at the back door, and kept people as best she could and helped people as best she could. My grandmother's name was Sadie Weinberg, from Montreal. My father always said that she was from the Odessa region of Russia. He was dark-skinned, and so was my father, and dark eyes. I'm going to digress for a moment. There may be a few people who still are entitled to practice law in this room, and they might appreciate this. 10 years ago, or 12 years ago, I was up in Perth speaking with Judge Matheson. Matheson was a county court judge, and Judge Matheson then became, I think, a judge of the district court, and he then became supernumerary and moved to Perth. I knew him very well. He knew my Uncle Jack. He was a very fine man. And when he retired, he took an extreme interest in genealogy. He did his own family tree. He would head off on anybody's family tree he could. I had an ex parte motion, which meant that I simply had to attend before him in his office without notice to the other party and ask him to sign a document, which I did, and it didn't take very long. And then he turned to me and he said, "Peter," he says, "if you don't mind my asking, you have a Christian name, Peter." I said, "That's right, I won't dispute the fact." And I said, "My brothers and sisters all seem of the same. I have Philip and Jane and Michael and Brian." "Well," he says, "Peter, I don't understand why, with a Jewish background, you would have Christian names." And I said, "Well, Your Honor," I said, "my mother was an English girl, but she had very fair skin and blue eyes. And you can see that my skin is rather fair and my eyes are blue. I said, to tell you the truth, Your Honor, I think someone fooled around at some point." "Oh," he says, "that's a terrible thing to say. How can you say that?" And I got out the door very quickly. However, back on Sadie Weinberg, she was the Odessa part of the Mirskys, and well loved. She had very high blood pressure, and her health suffered, and devoted to her children. And she died in 1939, just at the outbreak of war. She went down to New York and to visit relatives and friends, and came back on the train. And when she got to Toronto, she passed away. But she was a very fine woman. That was obviously very difficult for my grandfather. My father remembers the good times in the Glebe, though. For those of you who think that you can judge someone at their youth, let this be a lesson, because I think my father's moved on. He used to brag to us when we were children that when he was a child, he could ride his bicycle up and down the streets of the glebe and shoot the light bulbs out with his BB gun. He was very proud of that. He was very proud when he told me that in the basement of their Powell Avenue home, they got a hold of a 303 odd rifle and shot a cigarette out of somebody's mouth, blowing a hole into the wall and scaring the daylights out of Sadie. He was also proud of the fact that when Sam bought his first new motor vehicle and parked outside their Powell Avenue home, Mervyn and Jack jacked the wheels up. And when Sam got back into the car and hit the accelerator, they had the laugh of a lifetime. Eventually, they moved Pure Spring up to Aberdeen Street, which is not off Preston Street, and still not far from their area. And Pure Spring prospered. And after my father went off to war in '39, when he came back, he joined Norman. He was a lawyer, as Jack was, but he joined Norman in the business and my grandfather. And Pure Spring prospered, as I've said to you, and the company did exceedingly well until 1962. And in that year, unfortunately, Norman suffered a stroke, my Uncle Jack was killed, and my grandfather died. All in this, within a very short period of time. And it took the wind out of my father's sails, and it took the wind out of Norman's sails. So that in 1964 they sold Pure Spring, although Norman and my father continued to manage the company up until about 1986. My grandfather, David, I'd like to just concentrate on him again a little bit. Like I said, he's so different from Jacob by some accounts. Jacob, everyone that I've heard from, said that he was a very fine man, absolutely devoted to Judaism, very easy man to talk to, very kind and very considerate. And that's the kind of man I certainly would have loved to have known. My grandfather was a completely, using the words of my father, a complete and utter workaholic, driven to succeed, devoted to his family, aware of the lack of his education and self-conscious. A gentleman who came to this country, like so many, with nothing, saw what it was like to be poor, saw through the Depression what it was like to almost lose it all. I believe that he deserves an enormous amount of credit. He was industrious and energetic. He was imaginative. He realized the importance of an education. He actually borrowed on his life insurance to put Mervyn and Jack through university. He started with nothing, and he secured our family's future. I can always remember his wit and his sense of humor. I remember my grandfather so very, very well. We had a pretty good relationship. I remember as a young boy, we used to love, and others, my cousins and my brothers and I don't think my sister worked for Pure Spring, but we used to all love to go down, whether it's the streetcar at 5 o'clock in the morning or at Christmas or at Easter. It was just wonderful to be part of such a business. It was a thrill. And I'd often, as a young kid, maybe even 10 or 11, say to my grandfather, well, Granddad, you know, if you just, perhaps if you'd hire a person and do this, or if you'd move that conveyor, so forth. And he always used to look over his glasses at me, and in some of his Jewish wit, he'd say, you know, if you knew how much you need to know in order to know how much you don't know, by the time I figured that one out, he'd moved on. Or another one that struck me as rather comic, he used to say, you know, if you're so smart, why aren't you rich? And as a 10-year-old, I didn't have an answer for that. I was getting 25 cents an hour, and quite pleased with 25 cents an hour. But anyway, my grandfather's also the originator of something that I think is important in business, and that is the right attitude. If you're in the service industry, whether it's law or you're selling groceries or whatever, often you have customers who aren't pleasant. I quote my grandfather once a month. He used to say, don't get mad, just get the money. My grandfather's sense of humor, I can remember that he loved to take us, that is myself, my cousin Paul, and my cousin Douglas, to a resort at St. Agathe, and over the Passover Easter holiday. I remember one incident in which we were sitting at table, and a rabbi came up. It's a Jewish resort, and he said, "Dave," he said, "I hear you had a bar mitzvah, and you didn't invite me." He said, "I can only tell you I'm extremely hurt." And my grandfather put his knife and fork down, and he looked over his glasses and he replied, "And Rabbi, did you invite me to your bris?" Well, what did that company mean to us? It was our security, it reflected our success, productivity. Productivity, the psychologists will tell you, is linked to happiness. If you feel productive, you're happy. That was the glue that held our family together. About 15 years ago, just about at the end now, I hope I'm not taking too much time. About 15 years ago, I think my father summed it up best, what the family was to Pure Spring and what Pure Spring was to our family. He was asked to speak at a dinner at the Hunt Club for an organization called CAF, I believe. It was a group of independent business owners in Ottawa. People like Morris Lamoth, West Endy, people who owned their own business. It was a support group. There were 2 tickets. My mother declined, as she often did. She wasn't terribly fond of going to business functions or large functions. And I went, and I was his witness. I sat next to him. He was the keynote speaker. So my father told the story to a mixed audience, and I hope it doesn't offend anybody, but you needn't brace yourself. During the summer holidays, while my father and uncle were in university, they worked on the trucks. They'd come home and worked on the trucks, as they did when they were teenagers at Pure Spring, and they'd deliver soft drinks. They'd go out in the morning with a load, deliver to the various shops, pick up the empties, bring them back to the factory, and be back at the end of the day. The hotter it was in the summer, the more uncomfortable it was to work, but the more you sold. People drank more soft drinks, the hotter it got. On a hot summer's day at about 7:30 p.m., my father and uncle delivered soft drinks to a small confectionery somewhere off Somerset Street. When they went in, the shop owner was at the cash. There was nobody in, otherwise, no customers, just a small place. They delivered their product, the soft drinks, downstairs through the usual dingy crawl space and collected the empties and put them back on the truck. This took about 20 minutes. They were finished. They wanted to go home. They were tired. They wanted to get back to the shop. So they went back into the shop itself, and the shop owner was writing something at a small desk next to the cash. My father approached politely and asked the shop owner, would he kindly review and sign the bill? Well, the shop owner, standing there in his undershirt, answered rather rudely, waved my father off, and told him in his good time to stand aside. So my father did stand back and waited several more minutes. And then he offered to the shop holder again. He said, look, sir, he says, we don't need you to pay anything. You're on credit, just if you wouldn't mind something. You wait for me. Stand back. I'm busy. When I'm free, I'll get to you. My father has been known to have somewhat of a short fuse at times, but he still stood back with my uncle and waited several more minutes. Finally, my father approached it once more, but only got a few words out. And my father lost his temper, and he called the shopkeeper a no good SOB. And I don't want to go into what that means, but I think you all know. Well, the shopkeeper exploded in wrathful indignation. He was outraged. He called the Pure Spring Company immediately and asked to speak to the boss. The boss came on the line, and it was my grandfather. And the shopkeeper explained that he'd been rudely treated by a driver. He'd been called a no-good SOB, that he wanted all of the soft drinks taken out of his shop. He was not going to sell our soft drinks any longer. he might consider 25 complimentary cases, but he wanted it out, and he wanted it out now. And he was extremely hostile. My grandfather was patient and quiet on the other end of the phone, no doubt still smoking his cigar. And then, when there was a break, he said to the shopkeeper, he said, well, what does this driver look like?